Imagine a city. In that city, there is a community of black business people who are among the richest people in America. They own banks. They own insurance companies. They own property. They have built a financial system that works for them. Then, in just a few years, almost all of it disappears. This is not a story about violence or war. This is not a story about a natural disaster. This is a story about money. This is a story about how financial systems work. This is a story about how an entire group of wealthy and powerful black people was slowly and quietly erased from economic power in America. And the question we must ask is simple. Did this happen by accident, or was it planned? In the early 1900s, something remarkable was happening in Atlanta, Georgia. The city was becoming the financial center of Black America. On a street called Auburn Avenue, something extraordinary was being built. This street would later be nicknamed Sweet Auburn. But in those early years, it was a place of real economic power. On Auburn Avenue, black people were opening banks. These were not small banks. These were institutions that handled millions of dollars. Black people were starting insurance companies. These companies were worth millions. Black people were opening law firms and real estate companies. They were building hospitals and schools. They were creating wealth that their families could pass down to their children for generations. One man, named Alonzo Herndon, started a business that became Atlanta Life Insurance Company. This company made him one of the richest black men in the entire country. Think about that. In a time when black people were told they could not do things, when laws said they could not go to certain places or use certain things, Alonzo Herndon was building a business empire. He was making millions of dollars. The doctors in this community did not just treat patients. They used their money to build hospitals. The bankers did not just take deposits. They issued mortgages. They lent money to people who wanted to buy homes. They helped other black business people start new companies. These were not poor people. These were wealthy people. These were people who controlled millions of dollars. They were the black elite of America. So what happened to them? How did these wealthy, powerful people lose everything? The answer lies in something called capital. Capital is money, but it is more than just money. Capital is the money that a bank or a company has available to lend to other people. Capital is the money that a business needs to grow. When you have capital, you can take chances. You can start new businesses. You can buy property and expand. You can pass wealth to your children. But when you do not have access to capital, you are trapped. The black elite of Atlanta had built their wealth inside their own community. They had opened banks, but these banks could only lend money that black depositors had given them. They had started insurance companies, but these companies could only invest in what they could afford. They had bought property, but they could only buy property where segregation allowed them to buy. They had built wealth, but that wealth was trapped inside the boundaries of the black community. They had almost no connection to the larger financial systems of America. They could not borrow from the biggest banks in the country. They could not invest in the biggest companies. They could not access the capital that the white financial world used to grow their wealth. Think of it like this. Imagine you build a mansion. You spend years building it. You make it beautiful. You make it strong. But you only build it on one water pipe. You depend on that one pipe for everything. Then one day, someone turns off that water. What happens? Your mansion begins to fall apart. The people inside begin to leave. Everything you built starts to crumble. This is what happened to Atlanta's black elite. When the Great Depression hit America in 1929, it was a time when the entire country suffered. People lost their jobs. Companies went out of business. Banks failed. But the government did not let all banks fail. The federal government created programs to help white-owned banks. The government gave white-owned banks money. The government created ways for white people to get loans and keep their property and stay in business. But black-owned banks? The federal government did not help them. The government did not give them money. The government did not create programs for them. When black banks needed help, no one came. When depositors heard that banks were failing, they became afraid. They came to black banks and demanded their money. They wanted to take their deposits out before the banks closed. This is called a run on the bank. All the depositors come at the same time and ask for their money. But the bank does not have enough cash to give everyone their money at once. The money is in loans to other people. The money is in property. The money is in business investments. So the bank runs out of cash. Then the bank fails. Then everyone loses their money. This is what happened to black banks in Atlanta. Depositors panicked and took out their money. Loans went unpaid because people could not pay. Property values fell because no one had money to buy property. and the entire financial system that the black elite had built began to collapse. But the worst blow had not yet come. The worst blow would come from the federal government itself. In the 1930s, the federal government created the Federal Housing Administration to help people buy homes. But it made maps that color-coded neighborhoods. Green neighborhoods were safe for investment. Red neighborhoods were danger zones where banks refused to lend. The neighborhoods colored red were where black people lived. This practice became known as redlining. Banks drew red lines around black neighborhoods and refused mortgages there. Think about what this means. If you are a black family and you want to buy a house, you cannot get a loan from a bank. If you are a black business and you want to buy property to build a bigger business, you cannot get a loan. If you are a black person and you want to refinance your property or expand, you cannot get the money. Meanwhile, in the white suburbs, something different was happening. White families could get loans easily. White businesses could expand. White property owners could refinance and invest. Their property values went up and up and up. They built wealth that compounded year after year after year. But in black neighborhoods, there was no money coming in. There was no growth. Property values stayed flat or went down. Businesses could not expand. The wealth that had been built over decades began to stagnate. One policy decision, one map with red lines, one decision by a federal government agency, and the financial future of the black elite was changed forever. The people who made these decisions were not hiding. They were not secret about it. This was official government policy. This was written down in official documents. This was taught to bank employees. And no one stopped it. No court case challenged it at first. No law was passed to ban it. For decades, it was just the way things were done. By the middle of the 20th century, much of what Atlanta's black elite had built was gone. The banks that had held millions of dollars were closed or struggling. The property that had been owned was still owned, but it was not worth what it used to be. New property could not be bought because there was no way to get mortgages. Businesses could not expand. And then something else happened. The federal government decided to build highways through American cities. These highways needed space. The space came from neighborhoods. And which neighborhoods? The neighborhoods where poor people lived. The neighborhoods where black people lived. In Atlanta, highways were built through Sweet, Auburn, and other black neighborhoods. Businesses were destroyed. Homes were torn down. Families had to move. The neighborhoods that had been the center of black economic power were cut into pieces by concrete highways. The government called this urban renewal. But for the black people whose neighborhoods were destroyed, it felt like destruction. It was like taking the foundation out from under a building. And when you take out the foundation, the whole building falls down. By the time the civil rights movement reached its peak in the 1960s, the original black elite of Atlanta had largely been wiped out. The wealth that had taken decades to build had mostly disappeared. The banks were gone. The insurance companies had shrunk. The property ownership had decreased. The power had vanished. And here is the twist that makes this story even more painful. Atlanta would later become known as the Black Mecca. In the 1960s and 1970s and 1980s, new black business people would come to Atlanta. They would build new businesses. They would create new wealth. Atlanta would become famous as a city where black people could succeed. But the original black elite, the people who had built the first financial system, most of them were already gone. Their wealth was already lost. The opportunities that would come later would go to a new generation, not to them. The original architects of black wealth in America would not benefit from it. Compound interest means that when you have money, you earn money on that money, and that money grows faster and faster. $100 can become $1,000, then $10,000. But compound interest works both ways. If you lose money early, you miss decades of growth. If your great-grandfather kept his wealth from Atlanta Life Insurance Company, your family might be extraordinarily rich today. But because the wealth was taken in the 1930s and 1940s, the family never got those decades of growth. This is how financial policy creates lasting inequality. This is how decisions made 80 years ago still affect families today. Today, when people talk about the racial wealth gap, they notice that white families have much more wealth than black families on average. The government has studied this. The data is clear. White families have about 10 times more wealth than black families. But where did this gap come from? Many people think it came from slavery. Slavery was certainly terrible and created enormous injustice. But slavery ended in 1865. The wealth gap grew larger in the 1900s and 1900s, especially from the 1930s onwards. This means the wealth gap grew because of decisions made after slavery ended. The redlining, the refusal to help black banks, the highways through black neighborhoods, the refusal to give mortgages to black families. These were the decisions that created and expanded the wealth gap. These were policy decisions. These were decisions made by government officials and bankers. These were not accidents. These were systematic choices to keep black people from accessing capital. The lesson from Atlanta's black elite is this: wealth is not just about how much money you make. Wealth is about something much deeper. Wealth is about access to capital. Wealth is about having institutions that will lend you money. Wealth is about having a government that backs your investments. Wealth is about being able to diversify your money across many different investments. Wealth is about having protection from policy changes that could destroy your assets overnight. When a community does not have access to capital, even its richest members are vulnerable. Even the elite can be wiped out. This is what happened in Atlanta. The richest black people in America could not survive because they did not have access to the larger capital systems. They were locked inside their own community. And when the larger economic system turned against them, they had no escape. Today, we might ask ourselves, who has access to capital? Who can get loans from banks easily? Who can invest in real estate and see their property values go up? Who has the backing of the federal government? Who can diversify across many investments? The answer is that it depends on who you are and where you live. Some communities still have more access to capital than others. Some people can get loans easily. Other people cannot. This is not always because of their race directly, but the effects of past decisions are still visible. Neighborhoods that were redlined in the 1930s are often still poor today. Families that lost wealth to redlining might still be poorer than families that were able to build that wealth. Understanding this history is important. It is not just about the past. It is about understanding how power works today. It is about understanding that wealth inequality is not natural. It is not just about who works hard and who does not. It is about policy. It is about access. It is about systems that can help some people and hurt others. Atlanta's black elite were not erased because they failed. They were not erased because they were not smart enough or hard enough working. They were erased by financial isolation. They were erased by policy decisions made by government officials and bankers who decided that some people deserved access to capital and others did not. The hidden tragedy of Atlanta's black elite is that their story shows us how financial systems work. It shows us that capital is power. It shows us that access to capital determines whether a community can grow or whether it must shrink. It shows us that one generation's decisions affect many generations in the future. When we understand this, we begin to see the racial wealth gap differently. We see it not as something natural or inevitable, but as something created by specific decisions. And if it was created by decisions, then it can be changed by different decisions. That is the real lesson from Sweet Auburn and the rise and fall of Atlanta's black elite. That is the story that changes how we see wealth and power in America.